All right, diving in again today, we're looking at a religious organization and how it interacts with another spiritual group. It's a story about power, influence, and some really heated disagreements. Ready to get into it?
Definitely. This kind of stuff within faith communities can get really complicated, especially when different groups are involved.
Yeah, you're right. The organization we're focusing on is Chris Butler's Science of Identity Foundation.
Yes, yeah.
SAF, exactly. Butler himself seems to prefer keeping a low profile, doesn't really engage with the media much.
Yeah, and that makes SIF even more interesting to look at. It's like we only have a few pieces of the puzzle.
I like that. And to make things even more interesting, our sources come from all over. Former members of SEF, legal documents, news articles. It's like we're seeing the organization from every angle.
Yeah, having those different perspectives is key to understanding the whole picture. One thing that comes up a lot is the relationship between SIF and other Gaudiya Vaishnava groups, like the Narayana Maharaja Sangha.
Okay, so for our listeners who might not be super familiar with all the ins and outs of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, can you give us a little context? How are these groups different? What's causing this tension?
Sure. So Gaudiya Vaishnavism is a branch of Hinduism, and within it, you've got all these different groups, each with their own leaders, interpretations, and practices. They share a common theological foundation, but they can be pretty different in how they approach things.
Gotcha.
Now, SIF really stands out because they put so much emphasis on sticking to Chris Butler's teachings, and they really discourage interaction with other groups, including that Narayana Maharaja Sangha.
So even though these groups come from the same spiritual background, there's a clear division there, like a line in the sand. How does that actually play out in the lives of SIF members?
That's where things get really interesting. We've got stories from former members about how they were discouraged, sometimes even prohibited, from interacting with other Gaudiya Vaishnava groups.
Really?
Yeah, and that includes organizations like the Narayana Maharaja Sangha, Gaudiya Math, and even ISKCon.
Wow, so it's not just like a friendly rivalry then. These restrictions sound serious.
Exactly. And the impact on people was huge, for both individuals and families. Imagine being told you can't associate with certain spiritual groups, even if you feel a connection to what they teach.
Yeah, that would be incredibly isolating, especially in a religious context where community and shared beliefs are so important. It's almost like they're looking for spiritual unity, but creating division at the same time.
It's definitely a paradox. And it's led to some pretty heartbreaking situations. We found stories about families within SIF getting torn apart because some members were drawn to other Gaudiya Vaishnava groups. Some people were even ostracized, banned, just for interacting with other gurus or attending events outside of SIF.
That's so sad. It makes you think about the emotional and psychological toll that takes on people.
Absolutely. And it raises questions about religious authority and how much control these communities can have over people's lives.
It sounds like it goes beyond just personal interactions, too. Were there cases where this separation was enforced physically, like people not being allowed in SIF spaces?
Yes. There were accounts of people being denied access to SIF centers or events after they left to join other groups, like Gaudiya Math, the Narayana Maharaja Sangha, or ISKCon. It really shows how deep that separation goes.
So there's a clear us versus them mentality in SIF. But what was the reason for it? Why did Chris Butler and the leadership enforce those boundaries so strictly?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, our sources don't give us a clear answer. There's speculation, of course.
Yeah.
Some people say it's about maintaining the purity of their teachings, making sure members aren't exposed to anything that contradicts Butler's interpretation. Others think it's about consolidating power, preventing any challenges to Butler's authority.
So it could be a mix of things, theological reasons, social reasons, maybe even power dynamics.
Exactly. And it's something that needs more investigation, maybe even talking to current SIF members to fully understand.
You're right. We're only seeing a piece of the puzzle. And while we've been talking about these divisions and restrictions, I'm curious about the other side of things. What drew people to SEF in the first place?
That's a great point. It's important to recognize that for many people, SEF provided a sense of community, spiritual guidance, a framework for living a meaningful life. Even with all the controversies, we need to understand what made it appealing, what drew people in.
Absolutely. We want to understand the whole picture, the good and the bad, the complexities, all of it.
Right. And that's important as we move on to some of the more controversial aspects of SEF, like the people Chris Butler has been associated with. Some of those connections raise questions about the organization's ethics and finances.
Okay, now that's interesting. This deep dive is getting more and more complicated. and I'm definitely hooked. Let's take a closer look at those connections and see what they tell us about SIF.
As we dig deeper into these connections, it really highlights the challenges people face, when trying to balance their faith with their personal relationships. It's tough when your spiritual community tells you who you can and can't be friends with.
You're right. It's like trying to juggle two different worlds, your spiritual life and your personal relationships. And sometimes they clash in ways that get really messy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's especially tricky when you're talking about people who have been involved in some shady stuff. Like Patrick Bowler, also known as Paramahamsa Das. This guy was a convicted drug dealer, but he was also a student of Butler's, and get this, a financial supporter of a SIF-affiliated school in the Philippines. It's kind of a strange mix, right?
It's definitely a lot to process. How did SIF members feel about Butler being associated with someone like Bowler? What did the sources say about their reactions?
Yeah, the sources said that some SAF members were concerned about Butler accepting money from Bowler, especially knowing about his criminal past. They questioned whether it was ethical, like how could a spiritual leader take money from someone involved in that kind of stuff? It sparked a lot of discussion about transparency and accountability within SAF.
I can understand why people would be worried. It raises questions about the organization's judgment and whether they're being hypocritical. On one hand, there's all this talk about strict morals and spiritual purity, but on the other hand, they're connected to someone involved in illegal activities.
Exactly. And this disconnect between what they say they believe and what they actually do comes up again and again in the controversies surrounding SEF.
Yeah, it's like a crack in their image. Makes you wonder what else might be hidden.
It does. And speaking of hidden things, let's move on to another controversial figure linked to SEF, Joseph Bismarck, also known as Japa Das. He was a managing director of a company called QI Group, which later became QNet. And this company was under investigation for some pretty serious stuff like pyramid schemes and fraud.
Well, so now we have a convicted drug dealer and a potentially shady businessman, both tied to Chris Butler. This is starting to look like a pattern.
Well, it definitely raises some red flags. And the connection with Bismarck is especially interesting because he was a longtime follower of Butler. He owned properties that Butler and his disciples used, so there's no denying the connection.
So even though Bismarck's company was in all this legal trouble, he and Butler stayed close. That doesn't make SIF look very good.
You're right, it really complicates things. It brings up that question of judgment again. Why would Butler keep a close relationship with someone whose business practices were so questionable? Makes you wonder if there are other motives involved, maybe financial ones.
It's hard not to think about the possibility of financial wrongdoing, especially with those concerns about SIF's dealings with Bowler.
Those are valid concerns, and these controversies with both Bowler and Bismarck really cast a shadow on SIF's financial dealings. It makes people wonder where their funding comes from and how they're using it.
This is where the lack of transparency in SIF becomes a problem. If they were more open about their finances, maybe people wouldn't be so worried.
Yeah, transparency is super important, especially for organizations that depend on donations and contributions. It helps build trust and accountability.
Absolutely. Okay, let's switch gears for a minute and talk about Tulsi Gabbard. She brought SIF into the political spotlight, right?
Yes, the former U.S. representative and presidential candidate. She was raised in SIF and considers Butler to be her guru. She even made history as the first Hindu member of Congress.
Her political career definitely brought a lot of attention to SIF, especially with all the controversies we've been talking about.
It did. People scrutinized her campaign contributions and her views on issues related to India and Hinduism. Some people thought there was a direct link between her political activities and SIF, maybe even that Butler was influencing her.
But she has denied those claims, hasn't she? Saying that her faith is personal and doesn't affect her political decisions?
Yes, that's right. She's consistently said that her political views are her own and not influenced by Butler or SIF.
It's an interesting situation, though, right? The way faith and politics intersect, especially within an organization like SIF.
It definitely is. And it raises questions about the line between personal beliefs and public life, particularly for people in positions of power.
Speaking of lines, one of the themes that keeps coming up is the internal conflict within SIF. Leaked letters from former members, allegations of financial mismanagement, even claims that Butler himself was abusive.
Those letters are pretty disturbing. Former disciples talking about Butler's alleged verbal abuse, his controlling behavior, the pressure to give a lot of money to SIF. It paints a pretty dark picture.
And it's hard to ignore those accounts, especially when you hear similar things from multiple sources.
That's right. The fact that these allegations are so consistent makes them really hard to dismiss. It's not just one person with an axe to grind. It's a pattern of behavior reported by many people who used to be deeply involved with SIF.
The allegations about financial mismanagement are especially worrying. It sounds like members were under a lot of pressure to give money to SIF, even if it meant putting themselves in a bad financial situation.
Yes, that's a key point. And it raises questions about whether SIF is ethical in how they handle money and whether they're taking advantage of their members.
Those allegations of financial pressure and exploitation are serious.
Hmm.
Did the sources give any specific examples of how that happened?
Yeah. There are stories about people being pressured to sell their homes, cash in their assets, even take out loans to contribute to SIF. Apparently, the demands for money never stopped, and it caused a lot of hardship for people.
That's awful. It's a reminder that religious organizations, even though they have a spiritual purpose, are still run by people and can be vulnerable to corruption and abuse of power.
Very true. And it shows us how important it is to think critically and use good judgment, even when it comes to faith. We need to be able to question authority, figure out if what we're being told is true, and protect ourselves from harm.
It also reminds us that these controversies have real consequences for real people. Their lives are deeply affected by the choices and actions of those in charge.
Absolutely. We should always remember that human element as we continue looking into this complicated story.
I agree. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I have this uneasy feeling, and there are still so many questions. What about the people who decide to leave SIF? How do they deal with the fallout, the emotional and social repercussions of leaving a community that was such a big part of their lives?
Those are great questions, and they lead us into the next part of our discussion. Leaving SIF, it seems, was rarely easy. It was often a really tough and painful experience. Stay tuned as we delve into those personal stories and try to understand the long-term impact this organization has had on the people who dared to leave.
You know, it's interesting. We often focus on the inner workings of these groups, the power struggles, the controversies. But sometimes we forget about the people who are caught in the middle of it all.
Right, exactly. The impact on individuals can be really significant. Leaving a close-knit religious organization like SIF can be incredibly isolating.
And from what we've learned, SIF discourages outside connections, even with people of the same faith. That must make leaving even harder, like losing not only your spiritual home, but your whole support system.
It's a double whammy. Our sources really emphasize that. Former members talked about feeling ostracized, shunned by their friends, even their families, just because they chose a different spiritual path.
Like being stuck in a spiritual limbo, right?
Yeah.
You're not part of SIF anymore, but you're not fully accepted by other Gaudiya Vaishnava groups either because of the stigma.
Yeah, exactly. And that isolation can be devastating, especially for people who have spent years, maybe even decades, in SIF. Their whole lives revolved around this community, and then suddenly they're cut off. They have to start over, rebuild their social and spiritual lives from scratch.
It's a reminder that these religious disputes have real consequences for people. It's not just abstract ideas, it's people's lives. Did the sources talk about how former members coped with this isolation? Was there any support outside of SIF?
Some people found comfort in other Gaudiya Vaishnava groups, like the Narayana Maharaja Sangha or Gaudiya Math. Those groups offered them a sense of belonging, some spiritual guidance, and helped them through the transition.
That's good to hear. It shows that even with all these divisions, there are still people and groups who are willing to offer compassion and understanding.
Right? It shows how resilient people can be and the power of genuine spiritual connection. But it's important to remember that not everyone finds that support. Some former members struggle for years to come to terms with their experiences in SIF. They deal with feelings of betrayal, disillusionment, and confusion about their spirituality.
It's a reminder that leaving a group like SIF is a long and difficult process. The effects can last long after you physically left.
Absolutely. It can take years, even decades, to unpack everything emotionally and psychologically that comes with being part of a group like SIF. It's a real journey of healing and self-discovery.
Throughout this deep dive, we've discussed the controversies, the power dynamics, the questionable connections. But I think it's important to go back to the basics of SIF's teachings. What did Chris Butler actually preach? What was it about his message that resonated with people and kept them devoted, even with all the problems?
Well, from what we've seen, Butler's teachings emphasize a very strict interpretation of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, a big focus on devotion to Krishna, practicing bhakti yoga, and living a life guided by spiritual principles. There's a lot of emphasis on self-discipline, letting go of material desires, and striving for enlightenment.
It's interesting how those teachings on the surface seem to promote peace, love, self-awareness, but the organization itself seems to be all about conflict and control. It's like there's a disconnect between what they preach and how they act.
You see that in a lot of religious organizations, actually. The ideals they talk about often clash with the human imperfections of the people in charge.
Yeah, I guess that's the challenge, isn't it? Trying to reconcile those spiritual goals with the reality of human flaws.
It is. And it's a challenge that requires us to be discerning, to ask critical questions, to hold these organizations accountable for what they do.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the Science of Identity Foundation, I'm left feeling both intrigued and concerned. It's a story about spiritual seeking, power struggles, and the complexities of human relationships within a very tightly controlled religious community. It's been a fascinating journey, and we hope you found it informative. It just goes to show that faith, in all its forms, can be a powerful force, for good or for bad. It's up to each of us to approach these things with awareness, compassion, and a healthy dose of critical thinking. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.